Cold marble floors reflected every face that turned to watch, as Richard Moore laughed at his wife's tiny boutique in the middle of Manhattan's most luxurious shopping gallery. He pointed upstairs toward the glittering flagship of America's most celebrated luxury fashion house and declared that Elizabeth Moore would never belong in a world built for people with real success. Customers smiled awkwardly. Employees lowered their eyes. Elizabeth answered with nothing but quiet composure. No one in that crowd, not even the man humiliating her, knew that the elegant brand above them existed because she had built it from nothing and still owned every decision that truly mattered. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is. If you believe respect should never depend on someone's appearance, career, or perceived status, share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories of quiet strength, truth, and justice resonate with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. At 8:30 every morning, long before the first wave of shoppers entered the polished corridors of Manhattan's most prestigious luxury retail gallery, Elizabeth Moore unlocked the glass door of a boutique so modest that most people walked past it without a second glance. The sign above the entrance read simply, "Elm and Ivy." Unlike the dazzling flagship stores surrounding it, there were no towering digital displays, no velvet ropes, and no uniformed doormen welcoming celebrities. The window featured only a handful of carefully arranged garments, displayed beneath warm lights that made every fabric appear inviting rather than intimidating. To most visitors, Elm and Ivy looked like the smallest tenant in the building. To Elizabeth, it was the most important room she owned. She never hurried through her morning routine. Every hanger was straightened by hand. Every display was adjusted according to the changing sunlight. She greeted each employee personally before opening the doors, believing that people noticed sincerity long before they noticed luxury. Emily Parker arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I brought your usual." Elizabeth smiled. "You remembered." "I always do." Emily had worked at Elm and Ivy for nearly 4 years. She had often wondered why someone as talented as Elizabeth insisted on spending every day inside such a small boutique instead of expanding into larger stores like every successful designer dreamed of doing. She had asked once. Elizabeth had simply replied, "This store teaches me things that boardrooms never can." Emily had never fully understood what that meant. Neither had anyone else. By 9 o'clock, the boutique welcomed its first customers. A retired music teacher searching for a dress to wear to her granddaughter's wedding. A young attorney buying her first tailored blazer before appearing in federal court. A college student carefully counting every dollar before purchasing a scarf she had admired for months. Elizabeth treated each of them exactly the same. She remembered names. She remembered birthdays. She remembered which fabrics irritated sensitive skin. She remembered which customers were quietly rebuilding their confidence after divorce, illness, or loss. While fashion magazines celebrated glamorous runway collections, Elizabeth found inspiration in ordinary conversations. The woman who finally accepted gray hair. The father buying a graduation gift for his daughter. The nurse replacing shoes worn out after 12-hour hospital shifts. Every purchase told a story. Every conversation became a lesson. Few people understood that those quiet observations had shaped one of America's fastest-growing luxury fashion brands. The world knew the company as Maison Étoile. Business magazines described it as mysterious. Financial analysts praised its remarkable stability. Fashion critics admired its timeless designs that somehow remained elegant without chasing trends. Almost no one knew who truly owned it. Years earlier, when Elizabeth had begun sketching clothing designs from the kitchen table of a tiny apartment, she had made herself a promise. If success ever arrived, she would never allow fame to become louder than craftsmanship. When Maison Étoile began attracting investors, attorneys suggested a sophisticated ownership structure that would protect the company from hostile acquisitions, speculative markets, and unnecessary public attention. The operating company belonged to a holding corporation. The holding corporation was controlled through an irrevocable trust. The trust identified one ultimate beneficiary: Elizabeth Moore. Only 4 people besides Elizabeth knew the complete structure: Margaret Sullivan, the chairwoman of the board; Daniel Carter, the company's chief executive officer; Sophia Reynolds, general counsel and head of legal affairs; and the trust attorney who had drafted every document years before. Every employee believed ownership rested somewhere inside the trust. Very few ever asked further questions. Elizabeth preferred it that way. She never attended fashion galas as the company's owner. She never appeared on magazine covers. She rarely accepted interviews. Instead, she visited Elm and Ivy every day because customers spoke more honestly to someone they believed was simply another shopkeeper. That honesty was priceless. Around noon, Daniel Carter called through a secure encrypted line that only Elizabeth used for company matters. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon, Daniel. The quarterly reports are ready. I'll review them tonight. The board also approved the Chicago expansion." Elizabeth looked toward a customer trying on a cream-colored coat. "Wonderful. We'll need your final authorization. You'll have it after I've finished reading everything." Daniel smiled, even though she could not see him. He had worked alongside Elizabeth for almost 12 years. He had learned that she never approved anything she had not personally studied. Never. Not because she distrusted people, because responsibility could never be delegated completely. After ending the call, Elizabeth quietly slipped the encrypted tablet back into a locked drawer beneath the register. Seconds later, another customer entered. The transition from owner of a luxury empire to boutique shopkeeper took less than a heartbeat. She preferred it that way. No performance, no audience, only work. By late afternoon, another familiar figure appeared outside the boutique: Richard Moore. He wore an expensive navy suit perfectly tailored to his athletic frame. His polished shoes reflected the marble floor almost like mirrors. His confidence usually arrived several steps before he did. He glanced briefly through the boutique window before entering. Elizabeth immediately recognized the expression on his face. He had something on his mind. "Busy today?" he asked. "A steady day?" Richard looked around. Only 3 customers browsed quietly between the displays. "I suppose that's good enough?" Elizabeth continued folding sweaters. "It has been a nice day." Richard loosened his tie. "My meeting upstairs went well." "I'm glad. They're finally considering new commercial partnerships." Elizabeth nodded naturally, careful not to reveal that she already knew far more about those discussions than Richard himself. Harbor Crest Development, where Richard served as Director of Retail Development, had recently submitted an ambitious proposal involving premium retail spaces. The documents had crossed Elizabeth's desk 2 nights earlier. She had already highlighted several concerns. Richard continued speaking. "If everything works out, this project could change my career." "I'm happy to hear that. You know what would help even more?" Elizabeth looked up. "What?" "If people stopped associating me with this little shop." His words were calm, almost casual, which somehow made them hurt more. Elizabeth simply waited. Richard sighed. "You've always been talented." "Thank you. But don't you think you've outgrown this place?" "I like being here." He laughed softly. "You like hiding here." Elizabeth did not answer. Richard continued. "I spend my days negotiating with executives worth hundreds of millions of dollars." "I know. And then people discover my wife owns." He looked around again. "This." He never raised his voice. He never shouted. His disappointment lived in quieter places. That made it more difficult to defend against. Elizabeth carefully placed another folded sweater onto its shelf. What matters isn't how large a store is. Richard smiled politely. That's something people tell themselves when they stop dreaming. For a brief moment, silence settled between them. Emily worked quietly in the fitting room, pretending not to hear. Two customers exchanged uncomfortable glances before returning their attention to the clothing. Elizabeth remained composed. She had long ago discovered that silence often revealed more about another person's character than arguments ever could. Richard checked his watch. I have another dinner meeting tonight. I hope it goes well. It will. He walked toward the exit before stopping beside the window. You should think seriously about closing this place. Elizabeth looked at him. Why? Because one day you'll realize it has been holding both of us back. Without another word, Richard left. The boutique became quiet again. Emily approached carefully. Are you okay? Elizabeth smiled gently. I'm fine. You don't deserve that. Elizabeth looked through the glass storefront toward the elegant escalators rising to the upper level. Far above, hidden behind sculpted marble walls and crystal lighting, stood the flagship store of Maison Étoile. Customers lined up outside its entrance every weekend. International celebrities requested private appointments months in advance. Fashion editors called it one of the finest luxury retail experiences in America. Richard admired that store every time he visited the building. He simply never imagined that the woman folding sweaters downstairs had designed every collection hanging inside it. Elizabeth reached beneath the counter and opened a leather notebook. Inside were dated entries spanning years. Observations, meetings, promises, moments she never wanted to forget. She wrote only one sentence before closing it again. Some people measure value by what the world can see. Others build it where applause cannot reach. She returned the notebook to its drawer, greeted another customer with the same warm smile she had offered the first one that morning, and quietly continued working while several floors above an empire bearing her vision continued to flourish under a name that almost no one connected to hers. The following Monday began with rain. Thin streams of water slid down the towering glass walls of the shopping gallery, softening the morning sunlight into silver reflections that stretched across the polished marble floors. Umbrellas disappeared into elegant stands near the entrances, while shoppers drifted inside, grateful for the warmth and quiet luxury that surrounded them. Elizabeth Moore unlocked Elm and Ivy at precisely 8:30. The weather always influenced customers differently. Rainy mornings encouraged people to linger, to touch fabrics more carefully, to browse, without rushing toward another appointment. Elizabeth appreciated days like this because conversations became longer. And conversations revealed needs that sales reports never could. Emily Parker switched on the boutique's soft lighting. Olivia Brooks, the newest sales associate, arranged fresh flowers near the fitting rooms. You always replace them on Mondays, Olivia observed. Elizabeth adjusted a vase of white lilies. People notice fresh flowers even when they don't realize they're noticing. Olivia smiled. I suppose that's true. Small details tell customers they're welcome. Those simple philosophies shaped everything inside Elm and Ivy. Nothing was accidental. Nothing existed merely to impress. Every chair was positioned to encourage conversation. Every mirror reflected natural light rather than harsh spotlights. Every fitting room included comfortable seating because Elizabeth believed no one should feel hurried while deciding how they wished to present themselves to the world. Just after 10 o'clock, the boutique door opened again. Richard Moore entered. He was not alone. 3 men followed him inside, each dressed in expensive tailored suits and carrying the relaxed confidence of executives accustomed to closing significant business deals. Richard immediately noticed Elizabeth helping an elderly customer button a wool coat. He waited until she finished before speaking. Elizabeth, She turned. "Good morning." Richard smiled professionally. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues." Elizabeth stepped forward politely. Richard gestured toward the first man. "This is Kevin Harris." Kevin extended his hand. "A pleasure." Elizabeth shook it warmly. "Welcome to Elm and Ivy." Richard introduced the second. "Jason Mitchell." Jason nodded courteously. "I've heard you're quite dedicated to this place." Elizabeth answered with a gentle smile. "I enjoy my work." "And Brian Foster." Brian looked around the boutique with open curiosity. "It's charming." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied. For a brief moment, the introductions remained pleasant. Then Richard laughed. "I told them my wife refuses to leave her little fashion experiment." Kevin chuckled. "So this is the famous boutique." Richard nodded. "The one I've been trying to convince her to outgrow." Elizabeth remained silent. Richard continued walking slowly through the boutique while his colleagues followed. "You should see the flagship stores upstairs." He gestured toward the ceiling. "Now that's real fashion retail." Jason examined a display rack. "This shop feels cozy." Richard laughed again. "That's one word for it." Brian picked up a beautifully tailored cashmere scarf. "The craftsmanship is impressive." Elizabeth answered, "Our team takes pride in every piece." Richard smiled with practiced politeness. "Elizabeth insists on doing everything personally. I like knowing my customers." Kevin looked around. Still, this location can't generate much revenue compared to the luxury brands above. Richard answered before Elizabeth could. "Exactly." He folded his arms. "Imagine spending years building a career and then explaining that your wife owns the smallest clothing store in the building." None of the men responded immediately. The comment lingered awkwardly in the quiet room. Elizabeth calmly adjusted a display table that had shifted slightly after a customer walked past. Richard mistook her silence for agreement. "I've told her countless times." He smiled toward Kevin. "She could sell the place tomorrow." Jason asked casually, "Why doesn't she?" Elizabeth finally answered. "Because I still have work to do here." Richard gave an amused shake of his head. "What work?" She looked directly at him. "Listening." Kevin appeared genuinely puzzled. "Listening," Elizabeth nodded. "Customers tell you what matters long before market research does." Richard laughed softly. "That's a romantic answer. It happens to be true. But it isn't scalable." Elizabeth simply smiled. She had heard similar arguments many times over the years. Success, according to people like Richard, could only be measured in visible expansion. Larger offices, higher revenues, longer lists of public achievements. Very few understood the value of remaining close to the people a business actually served. Brian continued examining the boutique more carefully. "These garments don't resemble typical boutique merchandise," Elizabeth answered. "We manufacture them ourselves." "Really?" "Yes. The quality is exceptional." Richard interrupted. "Elizabeth has always been talented." His compliment sounded sincere for only a moment. "It's unfortunate she never aimed higher." Emily glanced toward Elizabeth, waiting for some response. None came. The elderly customer who had tried on the wool coat quietly completed her purchase before leaving. As Elizabeth handed her the shopping bag, the woman whispered, "Don't let anyone convince you to change." Elizabeth smiled. "Thank you." Richard's group continued walking toward the exit. Before leaving, Kevin turned back. "I hope your business continues doing well." "I appreciate that." Once the men disappeared into the corridor, Emily released a slow breath. "I wanted to say something." Elizabeth returned to organizing folded sweaters. I know. How do you stay so calm? Elizabeth thought for a moment. Because not every misunderstanding needs an immediate correction. Emily frowned. But he embarrassed you. Elizabeth looked toward the entrance. He embarrassed himself. Emily considered those words quietly. They were neither bitter nor triumphant, simply factual. Upstairs, Richard and his colleagues entered a private conference room reserved for prospective commercial partners. Harbor Crest Development had spent months preparing a proposal that could redefine the shopping gallery's future. Richard stood confidently before a digital presentation. Our objective, he explained, is to attract premium retail experiences capable of increasing long-term visitor engagement. Charts appeared. Revenue forecasts, traffic analyses, projected lease values. The presentation was polished, professional, confident. When it concluded, applause followed from several attendees. Richard accepted the compliments with satisfaction. What he did not know was that the presentation had already reached another audience. Far across the city, Daniel Carter sat inside his Maison Étoile headquarters reviewing the same documents. He pressed a secure communication button. Margaret. The chairwoman answered immediately. Yes. I've finished evaluating Harbor Crest's proposal. What do you think? Daniel paused. The financial modeling is optimistic. Too optimistic. I believe so. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Have you informed Elizabeth? Not yet. I'll prepare the report. Daniel opened another encrypted folder. Inside lay Elizabeth's handwritten observations from previous board reviews. She had identified several recurring concerns about Harbor Crest long before Richard submitted this proposal. Projected occupancy rates based on unusually favorable assumptions, maintenance estimates lower than industry averages, lease escalation clauses that shifted disproportionate risk onto property owners. Nothing illegal, but enough to require careful scrutiny. Daniel smiled slightly. Elizabeth always noticed details that others overlooked. He forwarded updated financial analyses to her secure account. Minutes later, while helping a young mother choose a winter coat, Elizabeth's smartwatch vibrated once. Only once. That specific notification meant board-level correspondence. She finished assisting her customer before checking the message. Daniel's summary confirmed exactly what she had expected. She typed only one sentence in reply. Continue independent verification. No conclusions until every figure is supported. Daniel smiled after reading it. That was Elizabeth. Never rushed, never emotional. Evidence first, opinions later. Late that afternoon, after business slowed, Olivia approached the register. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were those men important? Elizabeth nodded. They're working on a large commercial project. They didn't seem very respectful. Elizabeth closed the register drawer gently. Sometimes people become so focused on where they're going that they stop seeing what's directly in front of them. Olivia looked puzzled. What do you mean? Elizabeth glanced upward toward the unseen flagship store several floors above. They assume value always announces itself. Outside, Richard walked confidently toward the executive parking entrance, convinced the day had strengthened both his reputation and his company's proposal. He never considered that every word spoken inside Elm and Ivy had quietly reinforced an impression very different from the one he intended to create. High above the boutique inside a private boardroom overlooking Manhattan's skyline, Margaret Sullivan finished reading Daniel Carter's report. She removed her glasses and looked toward the illuminated skyline beyond the windows. Then she spoke only one sentence. Tell Elizabeth we'll proceed exactly as planned. Daniel nodded. She already expected that. Neither of them mentioned Richard by name again. There was no need. The process had already begun, and unlike public arguments or wounded pride-careful procedures, moved quietly, almost invisibly, until the day they reached their conclusion. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of elegance that Manhattan reserved for its wealthiest circles. Crystal chandeliers glowed above a historic ballroom overlooking Central Park. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase, while servers in white jackets carried silver trays filled with champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Executives, investors, architects, and fashion leaders drifted through the room, exchanging handshakes that often carried more value than contracts signed weeks later. For Richard Moore, events like these were more than celebrations. They were opportunities. Every conversation might lead to a new partnership. Every introduction could become another step toward the executive position he had been pursuing for years. Standing in front of the bedroom mirror an hour earlier, he adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo before looking toward Elizabeth. She emerged wearing a midnight blue gown of remarkable simplicity. There were no oversized jewels, no designer logos, no dramatic embellishments. The dress fit perfectly, flowing with quiet elegance rather than demanding attention. Richard studied her for several seconds. "You look nice," he admitted. "Thank you." Then his expression shifted. "But—" Elizabeth waited. "If anyone asks, try not to mention the boutique immediately." She looked at him calmly. "Why?" Richard sighed as though explaining something obvious. "This room is filled with people who manage billion-dollar portfolios. I understand. I don't want them assuming we're small." Elizabeth fastened a pair of pearl earrings. "I've never measured people that way." "I know, but they do." His voice carried neither anger nor cruelty, only certainty. That certainty had grown stronger over the past several years. Richard genuinely believed social perception determined opportunity. Elizabeth quietly picked up her evening bag. "We should go." The ballroom buzzed with conversation when they arrived. Richard was immediately greeted by several familiar faces. "Richard." A real estate developer crossed the room to shake his hand. Another executive introduced him to investment consultants visiting from Boston. Elizabeth remained beside him, smiling politely whenever someone acknowledged her. Most guests assumed she accompanied her husband, and nothing more. Richard seemed comfortable allowing that assumption to remain. Within minutes, they joined a circle of influential business leaders discussing luxury retail expansion. One investor turned toward Elizabeth. "And what do you do, Mrs. Moore?" Before she could answer, Richard smiled. "Elizabeth owns a little boutique downstairs in our shopping gallery." His tone sounded light, almost playful. "A charming little place." The investor nodded politely. "That sounds enjoyable." Richard laughed. "It certainly keeps her busy." Another guest smiled. "Fashion retail can be demanding." Richard lifted his champagne glass. "I've been trying to convince her to think bigger." Several people chuckled. Elizabeth remained silent. Richard continued. "I keep telling her there's a difference between owning a boutique and building an actual luxury brand." The words floated gently through the conversation. No one reacted dramatically. Yet Elizabeth noticed two women exchange brief, uncomfortable glances. One quietly changed the subject. Another offered Elizabeth a sympathetic smile. The conversation moved on. Richard never noticed. He believed everything had gone perfectly. A few minutes later, Elizabeth excused herself. "I'll be back." Richard nodded distractedly. He had already begun discussing commercial lease structures with another executive. Elizabeth walked toward the quieter terrace overlooking the park. The cool evening air provided a welcome contrast to the crowded ballroom. She rested one hand lightly against the stone railing. "You still prefer escaping to balconies?" The familiar voice made her smile. Margaret Sullivan stepped beside her. The chairwoman wore a classic black evening gown that reflected decades of understated confidence. "It's quieter here," Elizabeth replied. "It always has been." For a moment, neither woman mentioned business. They watched city lights shimmer across distant windows. Final slightly, Margaret spoke. "He embarrassed you again," Elizabeth answered honestly. "He embarrassed himself." Margaret smiled faintly. "You've said that before." "Because it's still true." Margaret studied Elizabeth carefully. "I've chaired corporate boards for nearly 25 years. I know. I've seen executives lose companies because of arrogance." Elizabeth listened quietly. "I've seen founders destroy their own legacies because they confused recognition with respect." Margaret turned toward her. "But I've rarely seen someone endure what you do without becoming bitter." Elizabeth looked back toward the ballroom doors. "Bitterness clouds judgment. And judgment matters now more than ever." Elizabeth nodded. "The Harbor Crest proposal," Margaret confirmed. "The board meets again next week. I've finished reviewing Daniel's financial analysis." "What did you conclude?" "Not enough evidence." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You still aren't ready?" "I've found inconsistencies, but not proof." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Exactly what I expected you to say." Elizabeth had built Maison Étoile using one principle above nearly every other. Never confuse suspicion with evidence. No matter how convincing an assumption appeared, decisions affecting people deserved documented facts. Nothing less. The terrace door opened again. Daniel Carter joined them carrying a tablet beneath one arm. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Margaret answered. "Not at all." Daniel handed the tablet to Elizabeth. "Our updated market comparisons." She accepted it. "I'll read everything tonight." "We also received revised projections from Harbor Crest." "Were there changes?" Daniel nodded. "Several. For better or worse. They solved some questions and created new ones." Elizabeth smiled slightly. "That sounds familiar." Daniel lowered his voice. Richard presented confidently. "I'm sure he did." "He believes approval is only a formality." Elizabeth said nothing. Margaret watched her carefully. "You've never told him?" "There was never a reason." "You've been married 8 years." Elizabeth looked across the city skyline. "I wanted someone who loved me before success." Margaret asked softly. "And now?" Elizabeth answered after a long silence. "I'm no longer certain he remembers that woman." The conversation ended as several guests approached the terrace. Margaret returned to the ballroom first. Daniel followed moments later. Elizabeth remained outside alone for another minute. She inhaled slowly before returning inside. Across the ballroom, Richard stood surrounded by architects, developers, and investors. The moment he noticed Elizabeth approaching, he waved her over. "There you are." She joined the group. Richard introduced everyone. "This is my wife Elizabeth." A distinguished older gentleman smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure." "The pleasure is mine." "I understand you're in fashion." Elizabeth nodded. "I am." Before she could continue, Richard interrupted once again. "She owns a small boutique." The gentleman smiled politely. "That's wonderful." Richard continued. "She refuses to expand." Elizabeth remained composed. The gentleman looked toward her. "May I ask why?" She answered calmly, "I like staying close to my customers." He considered that. Interesting. I learn something new almost every day. Richard laughed. Elizabeth believes conversations are better than market analytics. The older gentleman smiled thoughtfully instead of laughing. I disagree. Richard blinked. The gentleman continued. The strongest companies I've invested in all listened carefully before they expanded. Richard attempted another smile. Of course. The investor looked directly at Elizabeth. May I ask the name of your boutique? Elm and Ivy. I'll visit. I'd be delighted to welcome you. Richard checked his watch. I'm afraid we have another meeting. The group gradually dispersed. As they walked toward another section of the ballroom, Richard whispered, You could have been more ambitious. Elizabeth looked at him. I answered honestly. You always do? Is that a problem? Sometimes honesty isn't enough. She offered no reply. Hours later, after the gala ended, the couple rode home in silence. The city lights passed outside the car windows in long reflections. Richard finally spoke. Tonight went well. I'm glad. I think Harbor Crest is very close to securing the flagship negotiations. Elizabeth looked outside. I hope your presentation receives a fair review. It will. He smiled confidently. I've worked too hard for anything else. Elizabeth quietly folded her hands. She knew something Richard did not. Back inside Maison Étoile headquarters, Sophia Reynolds had spent the entire evening reviewing newly submitted financial disclosures connected to Harbor Crest's proposal. At nearly 11 o'clock, she discovered an unusual discrepancy between projected occupancy costs and supporting documentation. It was small, almost invisible. Most reviewers would likely overlook it. Sophia immediately flagged the file and attached supporting notes before sending everything to Daniel Carter and Elizabeth through the encrypted board portal. The message contained only one sentence. Additional verification recommended before any executive decision. Several minutes later, Elizabeth's phone vibrated. She read the message without changing her expression. Then she typed a brief reply. Thank you. Preserve every document and continue independent verification. She locked her phone and looked once more through the passing city lights. Richard believed the evening had strengthened his future. Elizabeth understood that the future was no longer being shaped inside ballrooms filled with applause. It was quietly taking form inside secured servers, carefully preserved emails, financial records, and legal reviews, where opinions carried little weight, and every conclusion required proof. The difference between confidence and certainty was often only a few verified documents. Richard had confidence. Elizabeth intended to wait for certainty. Monday morning began far earlier than usual for Richard Moore. By 6 o'clock, he was already seated in his home office, reviewing the presentation that he believed would define the next chapter of his career. 3 monitors displayed financial projections, architectural renderings, lease structures, and projected visitor traffic for Harbor Crest Development's proposal to partner with Maison Étoile. He had rehearsed every sentence, every transition, every answer to questions he expected the board to ask. He wanted perfection. Elizabeth quietly passed the open office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. I made yours. Richard looked up briefly. Thanks. She placed the cup beside his keyboard. Big day? The biggest. I hope everything goes well. It will. He leaned back confidently. Our numbers are solid. Elizabeth offered a small smile. I'm sure you've worked very hard. Richard interpreted her words as encouragement. I have. He looked again at the presentation. This contract could move me into senior executive leadership. I know how much it means to you. Richard nodded. For once, everything is lining up. Elizabeth remained standing for another moment. If the board asks difficult questions. Richard laughed. They won't. You seem certain. I've already anticipated everything. Elizabeth simply nodded before leaving the room. She never mentioned that she had personally spent 3 evenings reviewing every page of the proposal, nor did she mention that several questions remained unanswered. An hour later, Richard arrived at Harbor Crest headquarters. The executive conference room buzzed with controlled excitement. Kevin Harris stood beside the large display screen. You ready? Richard smiled. Absolutely. Jason Mitchell entered carrying revised financial packets. Legal finished their review. Richard accepted the folders. No major issues. Nothing significant. Brian Foster joined them moments later. I heard Maison Étoile's board will be represented by several remote participants. Richard shrugged. That doesn't matter. No. They'll hear the presentation. They'll ask a few questions. And then we'll move toward final negotiations. Kevin nodded approvingly. I hope you're right. Richard was more than hopeful. He was convinced. Precisely at 9 o'clock, the secure video conference began. Large screens illuminated one by one. Some participants appeared on camera. Others chose audio-only connections, protected by encrypted corporate systems. Margaret Sullivan appeared first. Professional, composed. Daniel Carter followed. Sophia Reynolds joined from the legal department. One final participant connected under a secure executive authorization that displayed only an identification code. No name, no image. Richard barely noticed. He assumed another board advisor preferred anonymity. In reality, Elizabeth sat alone inside a private conference room at Maison Étoile headquarters several blocks away. She wore a simple navy business suit. Her hair was neatly tied back. A legal assistant placed printed documents before her. Daniel's financial analysis, Sophia's legal summary, independent banking verification, occupancy research, regional market reports, every page carefully organized. Elizabeth adjusted her headset. I'm ready. The technician nodded. Your voice masking protocol is active. She preferred remaining unidentified until the appropriate time. Not because she enjoyed secrecy, because the ownership structure had always protected the company from decisions influenced by personality rather than evidence. The meeting officially began. Margaret welcomed everyone. Thank you for joining us. She outlined the agenda. Daniel summarized Maison Étoile's long-term retail strategy. Sophia reviewed procedural requirements. Finally, Margaret spoke. Mr. Moore, the floor is yours. Richard stood confidently. His presentation unfolded almost exactly as rehearsed. Architectural designs demonstrated how Harbor Crest planned to modernize portions of the shopping complex. Traffic studies projected significant increases in premium visitors. Financial models forecast substantial long-term lease growth. Richard spoke clearly, comfortably. Years of executive experience showed in every slide. Several participants nodded while taking notes. When he concluded, silence filled the room for several seconds. Margaret smiled politely. Thank you. Daniel added, an impressive presentation. Richard felt his confidence grow. Then the unidentified participant spoke for the first time. Elizabeth's electronically filtered voice remained calm. Mr. Moore. Richard looked toward the speaker indicator. Yes. I have several questions. Of course. The projected annual visitor increase, assumes an average growth rate of 11%. Correct. What historical comparison supports that figure? Richard answered immediately. Comparable mixed-use developments. Which ones specifically? He named 3 projects. Elizabeth glanced toward Daniel's report. The first project benefited from a newly completed subway extension. Yes. The second opened beside an international convention center. Correct. The third received substantial municipal tax incentives. Yes, she paused. Your proposal includes none of those conditions. Richard hesitated. Our consultants adjusted for that. May I ask where those adjustments are documented? Richard opened another file. I believe. He searched several pages. They should be included in Appendix C. Elizabeth calmly turned to Appendix C. There is no adjustment methodology described. Richard frowned. I'll provide supplemental documentation. Thank you. Her tone never changed. No accusation, only precision. She continued. Question 2. Richard straightened again. The projected maintenance costs remain approximately 18% below current market averages. We expect operational efficiencies. What documented efficiencies? Our management experience. Elizabeth looked toward another report. Could you identify measurable operational changes supporting that reduction? Richard paused again. We're still refining those estimates. I understand. She made a note. Question 3. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jason quietly reviewed additional spreadsheets. Brian looked toward Richard with growing concern. Elizabeth continued. Section 4.2 assumes full occupancy within 12 months. Yes. What contingency planning exists if occupancy reaches only 82%? Richard answered. Our marketing strategy should prevent that. That was not my question. Silence. What contingency budget has Harbor Crest allocated? Richard searched another document. He found no answer. We're confident occupancy will exceed projections. Elizabeth remained composed. Confidence and contingency planning serve different purposes. Daniel lowered his eyes, hiding a faint smile. He had heard Elizabeth use that sentence many times. It always meant the same thing. Evidence remained incomplete. Richard recovered quickly. We can certainly prepare additional contingency scenarios. Thank you. Elizabeth made another note. No emotion, no criticism, only documentation. Margaret asked, any further questions? Elizabeth replied, one final item. Richard inhaled quietly. The proposal references financing support from First Metropolitan Bank. Correct. Our verification confirms preliminary discussions. Has final financing approval been issued? Richard answered carefully. Not yet. So funding remains conditional. Technically. Elizabeth waited. Richard realized the implication. He corrected himself. Yes. It remains conditional pending approval. Thank you for clarifying. The questioning ended. Margaret thanked Richard once more. The board appreciates your presentation. We'll complete our internal review before communicating next steps. Richard smiled confidently. I look forward to hearing from you. The meeting concluded. Screens gradually disconnected. Harbor Crest executives relaxed almost immediately. Kevin clapped Richard on the shoulder. You handled yourself well. Jason agreed. Those were detailed questions. Richard nodded. Normal due diligence. Brian looked uncertain. Who was asking them? Richard shrugged. Probably an outside consultant. Very thorough. Richard smiled confidently. They won't stop the deal. Across town inside Maison Étoile headquarters, Elizabeth removed her headset. Daniel entered carrying another folder. "You were gentle." Elizabeth looked up. "I asked necessary questions." "You exposed every weak assumption." "They exposed themselves." Sophia joined them moments later. "I've already requested additional financial verification." Elizabeth nodded. "Good." Daniel sat across from her. "What do you think?" Elizabeth looked through her handwritten notes. The presentation itself was strong, but the supporting evidence isn't. Sophia opened another document. "We've also identified inconsistencies between projected maintenance expenses and contractor estimates." Elizabeth read every page carefully. No conclusions. Daniel smiled. "I knew you would say that." "We still lack complete evidence," Sophia were asked. "Should we pause negotiations?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not yet." Daniel looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because assumptions deserve verification." She closed the folder. "If the proposal is stronger than our concerns suggest, we'll discover that." "And if it isn't," Elizabeth met his eyes, "then the documents will prove it." Neither Daniel nor Sophia argued. They understood Elizabeth's philosophy better than anyone. Business decisions shaped livelihoods. Employees, families, communities. No one deserved consequences built on suspicion alone. Hours later, Elizabeth returned to Elm and Ivy. Emily noticed her expression. "Everything all right?" Elizabeth smiled gently. "Quite busy. Important meeting." "Yes." "Did it go well?" Elizabeth began arranging new arrivals on a display table. It answered several questions and raised others. Emily laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." Elizabeth smiled. "Sometimes progress begins with better questions rather than immediate answers." She greeted a customer entering the boutique. Within seconds, she was once again recommending fabrics, discussing tailoring, and helping someone choose clothing for an upcoming anniversary dinner. No customer would ever imagine that only an hour earlier, she had quietly questioned one of Manhattan's largest commercial development proposals. Nor would they recognize that the confident executive presenting that proposal had unknowingly defended his work before the very woman he believed spent her days doing nothing more important than managing a tiny boutique. Outside the boutique windows, shoppers continued moving through the elegant shopping gallery. Above them, hidden behind boardrooms, encrypted servers, and carefully protected corporate structures, decisions continued unfolding one verified document at a time. Richard still believed the most difficult part of the negotiation was behind him. Elizabeth knew it had only just begun. The first indication that something was wrong did not arrive with an accusation. It arrived as a spreadsheet. On Tuesday morning, Daniel Carter walked into the executive conference room at Maison Étoile headquarters, carrying 3 printed binders and a tablet. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glowed beneath a clear autumn sky, but no one inside the room paid much attention to the view. Elizabeth Moore was already there. She had arrived before anyone else, as she usually did. A notebook rested beside her coffee cup, its pages filled with careful handwriting instead of hurried bullet points. Every observation was dated. Every question was numbered. She believed clarity came from discipline rather than inspiration. Daniel placed the binders on the table. "Our finance department completed the first independent review." Elizabeth looked up. "Thank you." Sophia Reynolds entered moments later with another folder. Legal also received additional disclosures from Harbor Crest. Margaret Sullivan took her seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin." Daniel opened the first binder. "Our analysts compared Harbor Crest's projections with actual operating data from 12 comparable luxury retail properties." He projected several charts onto the large screen. The visitor estimates remain optimistic. Elizabeth nodded. By how much? Daniel changed slides. Between 9 and 14% depending on the property. Margaret folded her hands. Significant. But not impossible, Elizabeth replied. Daniel agreed immediately. Correct. Continue. The next chart appeared. Maintenance expenses, utility forecasts, building management costs, insurance projections. Sophia spoke this time. Several categories appear unusually low. Elizabeth studied the numbers quietly. Compared with what? The regional averages. How reliable are those averages? Daniel answered. Very reliable. Elizabeth made another note. Still not enough. Margaret smiled faintly. I suspected you'd say that. We're evaluating evidence, not expectations. Daniel continued. Our accounting team contacted several independent contractors. What did they report? Estimated maintenance costs approximately 17% higher than Harbor Crest projected. Elizabeth asked another question. Written estimates? Yes, verified. They've been authenticated. Good. She underlined one sentence in her notebook. Potential discrepancy. Verification ongoing. There was no excitement in her voice, no satisfaction, only focus. Sophia opened another folder. We also reviewed financing documentation. Elizabeth looked toward her. Any concerns? The financing itself appears legitimate. Daniel relaxed slightly. But, Sophia continued, certain assumptions within the supporting projections depend upon financing terms that haven't yet received final approval. Elizabeth nodded. So funding remains conditional. Exactly. Margaret leaned back. Richard acknowledged that during yesterday's meeting. Yes, Elizabeth replied. He answered honestly. Daniel looked surprised. You noticed that? I notice everything. There was no sarcasm in her answer, only fact. Richard had admitted the financing remained conditional when directly questioned. That mattered. Truthful answers deserved acknowledgement regardless of who provided them. The meeting paused briefly while everyone reviewed additional documents. Elizabeth quietly compared contractor estimates with Harbor Crest's internal projections. Several figures aligned perfectly, others did not. She circled 3 categories: cleaning services, mechanical maintenance, security staffing. Each differed enough to deserve further investigation. She looked toward Daniel. I want original invoices. They're not included. Request them. Daniel made a note. I'll have them today. Sophia added. I'd also recommend requesting banking confirmation for reserve allocations. Elizabeth nodded. Please do. Margaret observed the exchange silently. After years of working together, she no longer found Elizabeth's patience surprising. Many executives searched for reasons to reject proposals. Elizabeth searched for reasons to understand them. Sometimes that process protected partners. Sometimes it protected the company. Either way, it protected fairness. Across Manhattan, Richard's morning followed an entirely different rhythm. Harbor Crest's executive offices hummed with optimism. Kevin Harris entered Richard's office carrying coffee. You survived the board. Richard laughed. I told you there was nothing to worry about. Those questions were detailed. They always are. Kevin sat down. So, what's next? Richard opened his calendar. They'll request supplemental documents. And then, we negotiate. Jason Mitchell knocked before entering. I just received an email from Maison Étoile. Richard smiled. Already? Jason handed him a printed copy. Richard quickly scanned the message. His smile faded only slightly. "They're requesting supporting documentation." Kevin shrugged. "Standard procedure?" Richard nodded. "Exactly." The request listed several items: independent contractor estimates, maintenance assumptions, occupancy sensitivity analyses, reserve allocation confirmations, additional financing documentation. Jason frowned. "That's a lot." Richard remained calm. "They're thorough." Kevin leaned forward. "Can we provide everything?" Richard hesitated only a moment. "We should." Jason noticed the pause. "Should," Richard answered carefully. "Some documents are still being finalized." Kevin stood. "Then let's finalize them." Richard agreed. No reason to delay. He genuinely believed the requests represented ordinary corporate diligence. He had no idea they reflected questions personally written by Elizabeth after nights spent reviewing every detail. That afternoon, Elizabeth returned to Elm and Ivy. The boutique felt refreshingly ordinary after hours of financial analysis. A mother searched for a dress to wear at her son's graduation. An elderly gentleman needed a tailored jacket for his 50th wedding anniversary. A young teacher nervously prepared for her first principal interview. Elizabeth helped each customer with the same attention she gave board reports. Emily noticed. "You switch between worlds so easily." Elizabeth smiled while adjusting a sleeve. "I don't think they're different worlds." Emily looked puzzled. "Really?" "Both begin with listening." She finished pinning a hemline. "In one place, people describe numbers. In the other, they describe hopes." Emily laughed softly. "I've never heard business explained that way." Elizabeth folded another garment. "Business exists because people do." The boutique door opened. Thomas Walker, the shopping gallery's property manager, stepped inside. He visited occasionally to greet tenants. "Good afternoon." Elizabeth welcomed him warmly. "Thomas, it's good to see you." "I won't interrupt." "You never do." Thomas looked around. "The store looks wonderful." "Thank you." After brief conversation with Emily, Thomas lowered his voice. "I heard Harbor Crest's proposal is moving forward." Elizabeth met his eyes calmly. "It's under review." "They seem very confident." "Confidence isn't approval." Thomas smiled. "I suppose not." He hesitated before speaking again. "I've worked in commercial real estate for 20 years. Elizabeth waited. The people who appear most certain usually prepare the least for unexpected questions. Elizabeth considered that observation. That's worth remembering. Thomas nodded politely before leaving. Emily watched him disappear into the corridor. "He likes talking to you." "Thomas respects careful work." "So do you." Elizabeth smiled. "I hope so." Late that evening, Daniel called again through the secure encrypted system. "We received additional contractor estimates." Elizabeth opened her laptop. "I'm looking now." Spreadsheet after spreadsheet filled the screen. Some figures matched Harbor Crest's submission. Others remained noticeably different. Daniel spoke quietly. "Our analysts discovered something else." "What?" "The reserve accounts." Elizabeth looked up. "What about them?" "The reported balances appear accurate." She waited. "But projected future allocations rely upon assumptions that haven't been independently confirmed." Elizabeth leaned back. "So we still have uncertainty?" "Yes," Daniel sounded frustrated. "I wish we had clearer answers." Elizabeth remained calm. Uncertainty isn't failure. It feels slow. It should. Daniel understood immediately. Fast decisions often became expensive mistakes. Elizabeth had repeated that lesson since the earliest days of Maison Étoile. Speed impressed people. Accuracy protected them. She reviewed another page. Near the bottom of one spreadsheet, a small footnote caught her attention. Projected maintenance reserve subject to revised contractor negotiations. She read it twice, then a third time. Daniel. Yes. I want every communication related to contractor negotiations. Emails, meeting minutes. Those too. Phone logs, if they're available. Daniel typed rapidly. I'll request everything. Elizabeth closed the document. We're not looking for wrongdoing. I know. We're looking for complete understanding. Daniel smiled despite his exhaustion. You always choose your words carefully. Words shape decisions. After ending the call, Elizabeth remained alone in the quiet apartment. Richard had not yet returned from another networking dinner. She opened the leather notebook she carried almost everywhere. The page remained blank for several moments. Finally, she wrote, Incomplete information creates confident assumptions. Complete information creates responsible decisions. She closed the notebook. Outside, Manhattan continued glowing beneath thousands of lights. Somewhere across the city, Richard celebrated another productive day, convinced the additional documentation represented nothing more than ordinary paperwork. He could not see the larger picture forming. Every spreadsheet, every contractor estimate, every banking confirmation, every archived email. None of them alone carried enough weight to alter the future. But together, they were slowly assembling a portrait far more accurate than optimism alone could ever provide. Elizabeth understood something Richard had forgotten long ago. Success was rarely determined by the presentation delivered in a conference room. More often, it was determined afterward, inside the quiet hours when every promise had to survive comparison with documented facts. And those quiet hours had only just begun. By the beginning of October, Richard Moore had grown impatient. He disliked waiting. Waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty felt dangerously close to losing control. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since Harbor Crest Development had submitted its supplemental documentation to Maison Étoile's board. Richard had expected a prompt response, perhaps another meeting followed quickly by negotiations. Instead, there was silence. Professional, courteous, persistent silence. Every email from Maison Étoile thanked Harbor Crest for its cooperation before requesting one additional clarification, one more supporting document, or another independent verification. Nothing confrontational, nothing accusatory, only procedure. Richard began telling himself that the board was simply inefficient. He never considered another possibility. Someone was reading every page with extraordinary care. Elizabeth's mornings continued exactly as they always had. She unlocked elm and ivy at 8:30. She watered the fresh flowers herself. She straightened every display. She greeted Emily Parker and Olivia Brooks by name. Nothing about her routine suggested she was quietly overseeing one of the country's most respected luxury fashion companies. That consistency reassured her employees. It also allowed her to think clearly. On Wednesday afternoon, while helping a customer choose a tailored autumn coat, Elizabeth noticed Thomas Walker approaching through the boutique window. The property manager's expression was unusually serious. He waited patiently until the customer left before speaking. "Do you have a few minutes?" "Of course." Elizabeth invited him into the small office behind the boutique. Thomas closed the door carefully. "I wanted to tell you something before it reaches you another way." Elizabeth sat calmly. "What happened?" Thomas placed a folder on the desk. "This morning, I received an inquiry from Harbor Crest Development." Elizabeth remained silent. They're asking whether Elm and Ivy's lease could be reviewed before renewal. Emily, who had been organizing inventory nearby, looked toward the office with concern, but wisely remained outside. Elizabeth opened the folder. Inside was a formal request. Professional language. Standard formatting. Nothing openly hostile. Yet the intention was unmistakable. Harbor Crest wanted to know whether the boutique occupied valuable retail space that might be better utilized by another tenant. Elizabeth slowly read every page. No emotion crossed her face. Thomas watched her carefully. "I'm sorry. There is nothing to apologize for. I thought you should know immediately. You did the right thing." Thomas hesitated. "I've worked with enough developers to recognize these requests." Elizabeth closed the folder. "So have I. They rarely begin with direct eviction." "I know. They start by questioning profitability." Elizabeth nodded. "Then customer traffic. Then lease optimization. And eventually..." Thomas finished the sentence quietly. "They suggest relocation." Silence settled between them. Neither of them needed further explanation. Elizabeth thanked him sincerely. "I appreciate your honesty." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure whether I should say anything." "You absolutely should. I'm required to remain neutral. And you have." He smiled faintly. "I suppose I have." Before leaving, Thomas added one final sentence. "I never judge a business by its size." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "Neither do I." That evening, Richard arrived home later than usual. He seemed unusually cheerful. Elizabeth was reading in the living room. "Long day." Richard loosened his tie. "Very productive." "I'm glad." "I met with Thomas Walker." Elizabeth looked up naturally. "Oh." "We discussed future retail opportunities." "I see." Richard poured himself a glass of water. "This building has enormous potential." Elizabeth quietly turned another page in her book. "I'm sure it does." Richard continued speaking without noticing her calm expression. "There are tenants who simply don't maximize premium locations." Elizabeth looked at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Business is business." "Is it?" "Of course. If someone isn't using valuable space efficiently, eventually someone else should." Elizabeth asked gently, "And who decides what efficiently means?" Richard smiled. "Market performance." "Only that? What else matters?" Elizabeth closed her book. "Sometimes a business creates value that can't be measured immediately." Richard laughed softly. "That sounds idealistic." "No, it sounds practical." He shook his head. "I think you'll understand one day." Elizabeth said nothing. She already understood far more than Richard imagined. The following morning, Daniel Carter called through the secure executive line. "Thomas informed us." Elizabeth nodded. "I've already seen the request." "What would you like us to do?" "Nothing." Daniel frowned. "Nothing. Not yet. They're targeting your boutique. They're following a commercial strategy." Daniel sounded surprised. "You're defending Richard." "I'm describing facts." Sophia Reynolds joined the conference call. "The request itself isn't improper." Elizabeth agreed. "No. But combined with the timing." Elizabeth finished the thought. "It deserves documentation." Sophia immediately understood. "I'll preserve every communication. Every email, already archived. Meeting notes, saved. Internal correspondence, being collected." Elizabeth made another note in her notebook. "Maintain complete chronological record." Daniel leaned forward. You still don't want intervention? No. Why? Elizabeth answered quietly. Because people reveal themselves when they believe no one important is watching. Several days later, Harbor Crest hosted another internal strategy meeting. Richard stood before a conference table covered with leasing maps of the shopping gallery. Kevin Harris studied one blueprint. That boutique occupies a surprisingly valuable corner. Richard nodded. Exactly. Jason Mitchell looked uncertain. They've been there for years. So, they've never caused problems. Richard crossed his arms. This isn't personal. Brian Foster glanced toward him. It involves your wife. Richard answered without hesitation. I'm separating business from family. Kevin asked, what happens if the lease isn't renewed? Richard pointed toward the map. A luxury accessories retailer already expressed interest. The rent would increase substantially. Jason still looked uncomfortable. Have you spoken to Elizabeth? Richard sighed. She'll understand eventually. Brian remained silent. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the conversation left him uneasy. Richard noticed. You disagree. Brian chose his words carefully. I just wonder whether every profitable decision is automatically the right one. Richard smiled politely. In business, yes, absolutely. No one argued further. The meeting continued, yet Brian found himself thinking about Elizabeth's quiet boutique. He remembered her greeting every customer personally. Remembered the elderly woman Richard had interrupted weeks earlier. Remembered how comfortable the little store had felt despite its modest size. For the first time, he wondered whether success could be measured differently. Back at Elm and Ivy, life continued almost unchanged. A grandmother purchased a handmade wool scarf for her grandson. A newly engaged couple searched for outfits for engagement photographs. Elizabeth hemmed a sleeve herself after the tailor became unexpectedly ill. Emily finally spoke what had been worrying her all week. Are we going to lose the store? Elizabeth continued sewing. No. You sound very certain. I am. How? Elizabeth smiled gently. Because our lease remains valid. But they're questioning it. They're allowed to ask. Emily frowned. Aren't you angry? Elizabeth tied another careful stitch. Anger won't strengthen a contract. Olivia joined them, carrying inventory sheets. What will? Elizabeth looked at both young women. Preparation. She placed the finished jacket neatly inside its garment bag. We maintain accurate records. We fulfill every obligation. We treat every customer honestly. And if questions come, she smiled, we answer them with facts. Emily slowly nodded. I think I'm beginning to understand. Elizabeth returned the needle to its case. The strongest defense isn't the loudest voice. What is? The truth properly documented. Late that night after the boutique had closed, Elizabeth logged into Maison Étoile's secure executive portal. Several new notifications waited. One from Daniel, another from Sophia, a third from Thomas Walker documenting Harbor Crest's latest inquiries regarding tenant optimization. Elizabeth read each document carefully. She organized them by date, added handwritten notes, linked related correspondence, not because she expected immediate conflict, because complete records often became invaluable months later. Before shutting down her computer, she opened her notebook one final time. She wrote, "Pressure rarely begins with threats. It begins with reasonable questions asked for unreasonable reasons." Then she closed the notebook and turned off the office light. Several floors above the quiet boutique, The illuminated Maison Étoile flagship continued welcoming its final evening customers. Far below, elm and ivy rested peacefully in darkness. Richard believed it was becoming an obstacle to progress. Elizabeth knew it had quietly become something far more important. It was about to become the place where every assumption Richard had made about value, success, and power would eventually collide with the truth. The complaint arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, not by mail, not by a phone call, but through a formal visit. At exactly 9:18 a.m., as Elizabeth was helping a young woman choose a navy blazer for her first corporate interview, 3 individuals wearing identification badges entered Elm and Ivy together. The boutique fell unusually quiet. Emily Parker looked up from the register. Olivia Brooks stopped arranging a display near the entrance. The oldest of the 3 visitors stepped forward. "Good morning." Elizabeth smiled politely. "Good morning. Welcome to Elm and Ivy." He presented his identification. "My name is Robert Jenkins." Behind him stood another inspector, Linda Morales, and a younger compliance officer named Eric Dawson. "We're conducting a routine commercial compliance inspection." Elizabeth accepted the identification cards one by one, carefully reading each name before returning them. "Of course," Robert continued. "We received a complaint requesting verification of several operational matters." Elizabeth simply nodded. "We're happy to cooperate." There was no hesitation, no visible concern. She turned toward Emily. "Would you mind offering our guests some coffee or tea?" Robert looked mildly surprised. "That's not necessary." "I insist." He smiled politely. "Coffee would be appreciated." Emily disappeared toward the small staff kitchen, while Olivia quietly reassured the customers that the boutique would remain open during the inspection. Elizabeth invited the inspectors into her office. "Please tell me what documentation you'd like to review." Robert opened a checklist. "We'll begin with business licensing." Elizabeth unlocked a filing cabinet. Every folder was alphabetized. Every renewal certificate was separated by year. Every inspection record carried official signatures. She handed Robert the first binder. Business registration, the second. State retail license, the third. City operating permits, the fourth. Sales tax documentation. Robert blinked. "You keep excellent records." Elizabeth smiled. "They're easier to maintain than reconstruct." Linda reviewed several certificates. "Everything appears current." Eric examined another binder. "Insurance policies are active." Elizabeth quietly waited. No explanations, no defensive speeches, only patience. Robert turned another page. "We'll also need inventory sourcing records." Elizabeth opened a different cabinet. "Our suppliers are organized by region." She produced neatly labeled files: domestic manufacturers, imported textiles, custom fabric mills, independent artisans, invoices, shipping documentation, quality certifications. Every document appeared exactly where it belonged. Eric whispered almost involuntarily, "I've never seen records organized like this." Elizabeth smiled gently. "My father used to say paperwork should never become exciting." Robert chuckled. "He sounds wise." He was. The inspection continued. Customers still browsed quietly in the boutique. Emily continued assisting them while Olivia handled purchases with reassuring professionalism. No one raised their voice. No one appeared embarrassed. The atmosphere remained unexpectedly calm. After nearly an hour, Robert looked around the boutique. "We'll inspect the stockroom." "Certainly." Elizabeth led them through the rear hallway. Shelves stood neatly labeled. Garments were stored according to fabric type and production date. Climate controls monitored temperature and humidity. Even cleaning supplies were documented. Linda checked expiration dates on maintenance chemicals. Everything complied with regulations. Eric reviewed employee safety logs. Updated, signed, complete. Robert slowly closed his clipboard. "This is remarkably thorough." Elizabeth answered simply, "We try to do things correctly." At Harbor Crest headquarters, Richard received a brief text message from one of his industry contacts. "Inspection underway." He smiled. Kevin Harris noticed. "Good news." Richard slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Possibly." "What happened?" "I heard the boutique is being inspected." Kevin shrugged. "Routine." "Maybe." Jason Mitchell looked up from his laptop. "Or maybe someone filed a complaint." Richard answered casually. "Businesses receive complaints all the time." Brian Foster watched Richard carefully. "You seem unusually interested." Richard smiled. "I manage retail development." "Fair enough." Yet Brian sensed something unspoken. He remembered the earlier conversations about lease optimization. He remembered Richard describing Elm and Ivy as underutilized space. An uncomfortable thought crossed his mind. He chose not to voice it. Not yet. Back at Elm and Ivy, Robert completed the final section of his checklist. He removed his reading glasses. "Mrs. Moore." "Yes." "I have one final question." "Of course." "The complaint alleged your inventory included undocumented imported materials." Elizabeth opened another drawer without hesitation. She removed a folder marked Customs Verification. Every import declaration, every customs receipt, every tariff payment, every inspection certificate. Robert slowly reviewed several pages. Linda compared shipment numbers against inventory labels. Everything matched. Exactly. Eric looked genuinely impressed. "I don't think there's a single missing document." Elizabeth smiled. "I hope not." Robert closed the folder. "I believe we've completed our inspection." Emily approached cautiously. "Is everything all right?" Robert nodded. "Everything appears fully compliant." Relief spread across Emily's face. Olivia quietly exhaled. One of the waiting customers smiled. "I knew this place wouldn't have problems." Elizabeth thanked the inspectors for their professionalism. Before leaving, Robert paused near the entrance. "May I offer one observation?" "Please." "In 30 years of commercial inspections," he looked around the boutique, "I've rarely encountered a business this carefully managed." Elizabeth inclined her head. "Thank you. I hope whoever submitted the complaint appreciates how much time this cost." Elizabeth answered calmly, "I hope they find whatever they were looking for." Robert looked at her curiously. "You don't seem upset." Elizabeth considered the question. Someone had concerns. They appear unfounded. Then today answered those concerns. Robert smiled. "I suppose that's one way to see it." He handed her a signed inspection summary. No violations found. No corrective actions required. Case closed. After the inspectors departed, Emily locked the door briefly while the staff gathered near the register. "I was terrified." Olivia nodded. "So was I." Elizabeth placed the inspection report inside a protective folder. "There's no reason to be." Emily looked puzzled. "What if they'd found something?" Elizabeth smiled. "Then we would have corrected it." "But they didn't. Because we've always prepared as though inspections are inevitable." Olivia laughed softly. "You expect inspections?" Elizabeth nodded. "Every responsible business should." Emily shook her head in admiration. "You planned for this." Elizabeth answered gently, "I planned for accountability." That afternoon, Thomas Walker entered the boutique. I heard. Elizabeth handed him a copy of the inspection summary. He read it carefully. No violations? No. He smiled broadly. I can't say I'm surprised. Elizabeth placed the report into another folder labeled Regulatory Correspondence. Thomas noticed. You archive everything. I try. He hesitated. Do you know who filed the complaint? Elizabeth looked at him calmly. No. And you won't ask? She closed the cabinet. If someone wanted me to know, they would have signed it. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's true. But anonymous complaints still leave records. Elizabeth met his eyes. They usually do. Later that evening, inside Maison Etoile headquarters, Sophia Reynolds received another email. Its subject line immediately caught her attention. Inspection outcome, Elm and Ivy. Attached was the official government report confirming full compliance. Sophia forwarded it to Daniel Carter with a brief note. No regulatory concerns identified. Daniel called Elizabeth minutes later. I've read the report. So have I. Everything passed. Yes. Daniel hesitated. Should we investigate the complaint? Elizabeth remained quiet for a moment. Not yet. You really don't want to know? I do. Then why wait? Elizabeth opened her notebook. Because timing matters. Daniel leaned back in his chair. What are you thinking? The complaint itself isn't important. The person behind it is. And if someone was trying to create pressure... She wrote another line in her notebook. Pressure rarely stops after one attempt. Daniel understood immediately. You believe there'll be something else. I don't know. But if there is... She closed the notebook. I want the complete pattern, not a single incident. Daniel smiled despite himself. You always think several steps ahead. Elizabeth looked in through the boutique window as evening shoppers moved peacefully through the gallery. No. I simply wait long enough for the truth to organize itself. Outside, several customers admired the elegant display windows, a Maison Etoile on the upper level. Others wandered into Elm and Ivy, unaware that the woman greeting them with quiet warmth had just navigated an official inspection without a trace of panic. Across the building, Richard finished another meeting, convinced the inspection had accomplished something useful. He never requested the final report. He assumed uncertainty itself would weaken the boutique. Instead, the inspection had done precisely the opposite. It had created an official government record confirming that Elm and Ivy operated with exceptional professionalism. Another document. Another verified fact. Another piece quietly added to the growing file that Elizabeth never asked for, but never failed to preserve. And somewhere inside that expanding collection of emails, inspection reports, financial analyses, and legal correspondence, a larger story was beginning to emerge, one that still remained invisible to Richard. The inspection report had been closed for less than a week when another document quietly entered Maison Etoile's legal archive. Unlike the government report, this one was never intended to become public. It was an internal email. At first glance, it appeared routine. By the end of the week, it had become one of the most important pieces of evidence Elizabeth Moore had reviewed in years. The discovery began inside Sophia Reynolds' office. Stacks of legal files covered one side of her desk, while two computer monitors displayed encrypted correspondence related to Harbor Crest Development's leasing proposal. Sophia had spent nearly 3 consecutive days reviewing supporting documentation requested by the board. She was not searching for misconduct. She was searching for consistency. Contracts should agree with financial projections. Financial projections should agree with banking records. Emails should agree with meeting minutes. Whenever those 3 stories differed, questions naturally followed. Late Wednesday afternoon, a junior legal analyst knocked softly on her office door. "Do you have a minute?" Sophia looked up. "Of course." The analyst, Michael Turner, carried a thin folder. "I found something unusual." Sophia accepted it. "What is it?" "A communication chain forwarded with the contractor documentation." She opened the folder. Most of the emails discussed scheduling, tenant planning, and leasing logistics. Perfectly ordinary. Then one sentence caught her attention. "Let's make sure building management understands which tenants truly add long-term value before the board makes its decision." Sophia read the sentence again. There was nothing illegal about it, nothing openly threatening. But something about its timing bothered her. Who wrote this? Michael checked his notes. The sender was Andrew Collins. Sophia recognized the name immediately. Andrew Collins operated as a commercial leasing consultant frequently hired by Harbor Crest. Who received it? Michael pointed toward another page. Richard Moore. Sophia remained silent. The email continued. If smaller retailers become less attractive before negotiations conclude, future redevelopment discussions become much easier. Sophia slowly closed the folder. When was this sent? 3 days before the inspection at Elm and Ivy. She immediately understood why the email deserved attention. Still, one email proved nothing. Perhaps Andrew had merely expressed a poorly worded business opinion. Perhaps Richard had rejected the suggestion. Perhaps nothing happened at all. Assumptions solved nothing. Evidence did. She thanked Michael. "Please preserve the original files. They've already been archived." "Excellent. Should I notify Daniel?" "I will." Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel Carter joined Sophia inside the legal department. She handed him the printed email chain. Daniel read every page carefully. His expression remained neutral. "What do you think?" Sophia answered honestly. "I think it deserves further review." "Agreed. Nothing here establishes wrongdoing." "No, but the timing deserves attention." Daniel nodded. "The inspection." "Exactly." He placed the folder back on the desk. "We should inform Elizabeth." "Immediately." That evening, Elizabeth remained inside Elm and Ivy, nearly an hour after closing. The boutique had become wonderfully quiet. Only soft jazz played through hidden speakers while Emily and Olivia finished organizing inventory before heading home. Elizabeth sat alone behind the register, reviewing customer notes from the day. A woman preparing for chemotherapy needed clothing with softer seams. A young accountant requested professional attire within a limited budget. A father hoped to surprise his daughter with her first tailored coat before college. Those notes mattered just as much to Elizabeth as financial reports. Both described people. Her secure phone vibrated once. "Daniel." She answered immediately. "Good evening." "We found something." Elizabeth listened without interrupting while Daniel summarized the email chain. When he finished, she asked only one question. "Have you verified authenticity?" "Yes." "Metadata?" "Confirmed." "Original server copies?" "Preserved." Elizabeth remained thoughtful. "What about Richard's response?" Daniel paused. "There wasn't one." "No reply?" "None." She considered that carefully. Silence could mean many things. Agreement, disagreement, disinterest, forgetfulness. No responsible conclusion could be reached yet. "Send me everything. You'll have it in 2 minutes." "And Daniel?" "Yes." "Do not characterize the documents." He smiled. "I know. Facts only." The encrypted files arrived almost immediately. Elizabeth read every message from beginning to end. Twice. The wording remained cautious, indirect, professionally written. Yet the sequence troubled her. First came discussion about tenant value, then redevelopment strategy, then questions about elm and ivy, then the inspection. Each event could easily be explained independently. Together, however, they suggested a pattern worth examining. She opened her notebook. October 14th. Possible chronological relationship. Further corroboration required. No conclusions. She underlined the final two words. No conclusions. The following morning, Harbor Crest held another executive planning session. Richard entered carrying updated leasing projections. Kevin Harris looked unusually optimistic. I heard Maison Étoile requested another meeting. Richard smiled. They did. Good sign. I think so. Jason Mitchell added, they're also asking for more correspondence regarding contractor negotiations. Richard shrugged. They're thorough. Brian Foster watched him. Doesn't that concern you? Not particularly. Brian hesitated. They're reviewing everything. They should. Richard sat down. We have nothing to hide. The meeting continued. Discussion shifted toward redevelopment priorities. Andrew Collins joined remotely by video conference. His connection flickered briefly before stabilizing. Good morning, everyone. Richard nodded. Morning. Andrew displayed revised leasing maps. We've identified several opportunities to strengthen premium tenant placement. One section highlighted the corner occupied by elm and ivy. Andrew circled it digitally. This location continues attracting attention. Brian glanced toward Richard. Richard remained expressionless. Andrew continued. If redevelopment proceeds, this corner becomes extremely valuable. Jason asked, what about the current tenant? Andrew answered professionally. That depends on future leasing strategy. No one said Elizabeth's name. No one needed to. Later that afternoon, Sophia made another discovery. While comparing archived communications, she noticed several telephone conferences listed on Andrew Collins' scheduling records. Most included ordinary project discussions. One entry stood out. Private consultation regarding tenant optimization, held 48 hours before the inspection. No transcript existed. No recording had been preserved. Sophia immediately documented the missing information. Rather than speculate, she simply added another factual note. Telephone conference occurred. Content unavailable. Relationship to later events undetermined. She forwarded everything to Elizabeth. Minutes later, Elizabeth replied. Continue documenting chronology. Nothing else. No theories. No accusations. Only chronology. Emily found Elizabeth unusually quiet that evening. Tough day, Elizabeth smiled. Productive. You've been reading documents every night lately. Quite a few. Emily laughed. I don't know how you stay patient. Elizabeth looked toward the boutique window. Truth rarely arrives all at once. What do you mean? It usually appears one document at a time. Emily tilted her head. And eventually, Elizabeth folded another sweater. The documents begin agreeing with one another, and then, you no longer need opinions. Emily thought about that for several moments. I've never looked at paperwork that way. Most people don't. Elizabeth smiled gently. But paperwork remembers what people forget. That night, after Richard returned home, he seemed unusually energized. The board wants another review. Elizabeth looked up from her book. They're still interested. I believe so. That's encouraging. Richard loosened his tie. They're asking for more documentation. Elizabeth asked calmly, "Does that concern you?" "Not really." He smiled confidently. "Eventually, they'll run out of questions." Elizabeth closed her book. "Perhaps." Richard laughed. "You sound skeptical." "I sound patient." He shook his head. "You've always had more patience than I do." Elizabeth met his eyes. "Sometimes patience saves people from expensive mistakes." Richard smiled politely, assuming she referred to ordinary business decisions. He had no way of knowing that several encrypted folders now existed inside Maison Etoile's legal archive. Folders containing inspection reports, chronological timelines, financial analyses, verified email chains, meeting records, telephone logs. None of them alone threatened Harbor Crest. None of them alone implicated Richard. But together, they were slowly revealing how decisions had unfolded over time. Elizabeth never intended to win through confrontation. She intended to understand completely before acting at all. Outside, Manhattan settled into another quiet autumn night. The lights inside Maison Etoile's flagship gradually dimmed as employees finished closing procedures. Downstairs, Elm and Ivy prepared for another ordinary morning. And inside a secure legal server protected by encryption and careful procedure, the file bearing Harbor Crest's name grew just a little thicker, not because anyone sought revenge, but because every verified fact deserved its proper place in the story, before the story could finally tell the truth. Nearly a month after Harbor Crest had submitted its original proposal, the announcement everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Maison Etoile would host a private ceremony inside the shopping gallery to introduce its strategic development partner for the next phase of expansion. The invitation list was remarkably selective. Members of the fashion press, commercial real estate executives, luxury investors, board representatives, several city officials, longtime retail partners. The event would take place directly beneath the soaring atrium that connected the lower boutiques with the flagship stores above. The location was symbolic. Every guest standing on the marble floor could look upward and see the illuminated facade of Maison Etoile's flagship suspended above like a crown overlooking the building. Richard Moore regarded the invitation as confirmation that Harbor Crest had already won. They wouldn't organize something this formal unless the decision was practically made, he told Kevin Harris while adjusting his tie before leaving the office. Kevin smiled. "I hope you're right." Jason Mitchell sounded more cautious. "They still haven't officially approved anything." Richard waved away the concern. "That's just procedure." Brian Foster remained unusually quiet. He had learned over the past several weeks that Maison Etoile rarely acted without purpose. Silence from that board no longer felt accidental. It felt deliberate. At Elm and Ivy, Elizabeth prepared for the morning exactly as she always did. Fresh flowers stood beside the entrance. The displays had been rearranged overnight to feature the boutique's autumn collection. Soft instrumental music drifted quietly through the store. Nothing suggested that before the day ended, her life would change publicly for the first time in years. Emily Parker looked toward Elizabeth while steaming a navy wool coat. "Are you attending the announcement upstairs?" Elizabeth nodded. "For a little while." "You finally get a break." Elizabeth smiled. "I wouldn't call it that." Olivia Brooks laughed. "I've never met anyone who works on her day off." Elizabeth adjusted a mannequin scarf. "I enjoy being useful." Emily hesitated. "Do you think Harbor Crest will get the contract?" Elizabeth looked toward the upper floors visible through the boutique window. "I think the board will make the decision they believe is right." Emily noticed the careful wording. "You already sound like one of them." Elizabeth simply smiled. She neither confirmed nor denied anything. By early afternoon, photographers had begun gathering near the central atrium. Elegant floral arrangements surrounded a temporary stage. Rows of white chairs faced a large presentation screen displaying only one sentence: "The future of excellence begins today." Employees from dozens of luxury retailers watched quietly from balconies above. Customers slowed their shopping to observe the preparations. Speculation spread throughout the building. Who would become Maison Étoile's newest strategic partner? Richard arrived almost an hour early. He enjoyed arriving before the crowd. It allowed him to greet influential guests personally. He shook hands with investors, exchanged business cards with developers, accepted congratulations that, although premature, reinforced his confidence. Kevin approached, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You already look like you've won." Richard smiled. "I've earned the optimism." Brian quietly observed the growing crowd. What if they surprise everyone? Richard laughed. "With what? We still don't know who the owner is." Richard shrugged. "Some billionaire who prefers privacy?" "Perhaps. It doesn't matter." Richard looked toward the stage. Whoever they are, they'll recognize a good proposal. Elizabeth closed elm and ivy temporarily for 1 hour. A handwritten sign appeared on the door. "Back shortly." Emily locked the entrance behind them. "You look nervous," Olivia whispered. "I'm excited." Elizabeth stood between them. "No matter what happens today," both young women looked at her. "Remember that kindness never becomes less valuable because someone fails to recognize it." Emily smiled. "That's oddly specific." Elizabeth only answered, "It seemed worth saying." The 3 women walked quietly toward the atrium. No reporters approached Elizabeth. No photographers recognized her. Most assumed she was simply another boutique owner attending a building event, exactly as she preferred. The ceremony began promptly at 3 o'clock. Margaret Sullivan stepped onto the stage first. Her calm authority immediately quieted the room. "Good afternoon." She welcomed everyone before speaking briefly about Maison Étoile's history. Without mentioning names, she described the company's commitment to craftsmanship, integrity, and long-term thinking. Then Daniel Carter joined her. He summarized the months of evaluation that had preceded the day's announcement. "Our board reviewed every proposal according to the same standards: financial responsibility, operational excellence, ethical governance, long-term sustainability." No applause interrupted him. The audience listened carefully. Richard stood near the front beside Kevin, Jason, and Brian. He smiled confidently. Everything sounded exactly as expected. Daniel concluded. "Today's announcement represents not only a commercial decision," he paused, "but also a reaffirmation of the principles upon which this company was built." Richard nodded approvingly. Then Margaret returned to the podium. "Before discussing our future partnerships," she looked slowly across the audience, "there is someone you deserve to meet." A murmur spread through the crowd. Finally, the mysterious owner. Richard folded his arms with quiet anticipation. Margaret continued. "For more than a decade, one individual has protected this company from unnecessary publicity." Photographers adjusted their cameras. The founder believed that brands should be judged by their work rather than by personalities. Several executives exchanged curious glances. "Today," Margaret smiled gently, "that founder has agreed to step forward." Richard instinctively looked toward the stage entrance, expecting an unfamiliar face. A billionaire investor, perhaps an elderly fashion icon, perhaps an international entrepreneur. Instead, Margaret turned toward the audience itself. "Elizabeth." The single word echoed softly through the atrium. For several seconds, no one moved. Emily looked toward Elizabeth. Olivia did the same. Richard frowned. Surely someone else shared that name. Then Elizabeth quietly stepped forward. She walked through the crowd with the same calm pace she used every morning inside Elm and Ivy. No dramatic music played. No spotlight followed her. The silence itself became more powerful than applause. Richard stared in complete disbelief. Kevin blinked repeatedly. Jason lowered his program. Brian slowly whispered, "Elizabeth." She climbed the short staircase onto the stage. Margaret greeted her with unmistakable respect. Daniel smiled warmly. Sophia Reynolds joined them beside the podium. The photographers, initially confused, suddenly erupted into frantic activity. Camera shutters echoed throughout the atrium. Margaret addressed the audience. "It is my privilege to introduce the founder, principal owner, and controlling trustee of Maison Étoile." She looked toward Elizabeth. "Miss Elizabeth Moore." The words seemed to suspend time. No one applauded immediately. Shock arrived first. Richard felt every confident assumption of the past several years collapse simultaneously. His wife, the woman he had repeatedly described as a boutique owner, the woman he had pitied, the woman whose career he had dismissed. She stood calmly beside the leadership of one of America's most respected luxury fashion houses. Not as a guest, not as an executive employee, as its owner. Daniel continued, "Many of you have wondered why our founder remained anonymous." He smiled toward Elizabeth. "Because she believed listening to customers mattered more than collecting recognition." Several reporters began writing furiously. Others transmitted breaking updates directly from their phones. Margaret added, "For more than 10 years, Elizabeth has continued working inside Elm and Ivy by personal choice." The audience turned instinctively toward the boutique visible below the upper galleries. "The boutique has never been a hobby," Daniel continued. "It has always been our founder's living research studio." Richard's breathing became noticeably uneven. Every conversation, every insult, every suggestion that she closed the boutique, every comparison to the flagship upstairs. Each memory returned with merciless clarity. Elizabeth stepped toward the microphone. The room became perfectly silent. She looked across the audience. Her eyes briefly passed over Richard. There was no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph, only quiet composure. "Thank you for being here." Her voice remained steady. "I've always believed beautiful clothing begins by understanding ordinary lives." She paused. "Everything we've built at Maison Étoile began with conversations inside a small boutique." She smiled gently. "I hope we never become too successful to keep listening." Nothing more. No explanation, no defense, no revelation about Richard, no public humiliation. She stepped away from the microphone. The applause began slowly, then spread throughout the atrium until the entire building echoed with it. Richard remained frozen. For the first time in many years, he found himself standing inside a room where status could not protect him from the truth. And the truth had only just become public. For several long seconds after the applause began, Richard Moore heard almost nothing. The cameras, the reporters, the conversations erupting throughout the atrium. All of it seemed strangely distant, muffled beneath the weight of a single realization. Elizabeth had never been standing beneath the luxury brand. She had always been standing above it. Not physically, but legally, financially, and morally. He replayed countless memories in his mind. The first time he had laughed at Elm and Ivy's modest storefront. The dinner parties where he introduced her as the owner of a little boutique. The colleagues he had guided into the shop simply to demonstrate how much larger his own ambitions were. Every moment returned with painful clarity. None of those humiliations had ever forced Elizabeth to defend herself, because she had never needed to. The applause gradually faded. Margaret Sullivan resumed speaking. Today is not about celebrating a hidden identity. She looked across the audience. It is about honoring the values that built this company. Daniel Carter stepped beside her. Many organizations begin with capital. He smiled toward Elizabeth. Maison Étoile began with careful observation. Photographs from the company's early years appeared on the giant screen. A tiny rented workshop, sketchbooks filled with handwritten notes, fabric samples spread across a wooden kitchen table, an old sewing machine. Then another photograph, elm and ivy. Not the polished boutique it had become, a far smaller storefront from years earlier. Elizabeth herself stood inside the picture, arranging dresses before opening for business. A murmur swept through the audience. Reporters quickly photographed the historical images. Few luxury founders would voluntarily reveal such humble beginnings. Elizabeth seemed entirely comfortable doing so. Daniel continued. Every major collection we've introduced during the past decade originated from conversations held inside that boutique. Another photograph appeared. Elizabeth helping an elderly customer choose a coat. Another. Listening carefully while a young mother adjusted a child's jacket. Another. Making handwritten alterations herself. Richard stared silently. He had passed those moments hundreds of times. He had dismissed them all. Near the rear of the audience, Kevin Harris quietly leaned toward Jason Mitchell. I thought she was just... He stopped speaking. Jason finished the sentence. So did all of us. Brian Foster never took his eyes off the stage. I don't think she ever lied. Kevin frowned. No. We simply assumed. Jason looked down, and Richard kept reinforcing those assumptions. None of them spoke again. Elizabeth returned to her seat beside Margaret after the presentation concluded. Almost immediately, reporters formed an orderly line, hoping to ask questions. A journalist from a national business publication spoke first. Miss Moore, why remain anonymous for so many years? Elizabeth smiled politely. Because recognition was never the objective. Another reporter asked, why continue working inside Elm and Ivy? She answered without hesitation. Customers speak honestly to someone they believe has nothing to prove. Pens moved rapidly across notebooks. Microphones edged closer. A television correspondent asked, did anyone outside your executive leadership know the truth? Elizabeth shook her head gently. Very few people. Why? Privacy protected the company. She paused briefly. And it protected me. Another question followed. How involved are you in day-to-day decisions? Daniel smiled quietly. Elizabeth answered herself. Every major decision eventually reaches my desk. Richard lowered his head. Every major decision, his proposal, his presentations, every document, every question during the board meetings, the unidentified participant, the calm voice requesting evidence, his wife. Sophia Reynolds approached the podium carrying several folders. We'll now discuss the strategic partnership review. The atmosphere shifted. Reporters sensed another announcement approaching. Sophia continued. As part of our standard governance process, she emphasized the word standard. Every proposal undergoes comprehensive legal and financial verification. Slides appeared behind her. Evaluation criteria, risk assessment procedures, independent auditing requirements. No company names, no accusations. Simply process. Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Daniel spoke next. Several proposals demonstrated considerable strengths. Another slide appeared. However, additional documentation remained under review. Financial verification ongoing. Operational assumptions pending confirmation. No final commercial agreement has been approved. The audience looked surprised. Richard stared at the screen. No approval. His confidence had blinded him to the obvious. Today's ceremony had never been organized to announce Harbor Crest as the winner. It had been organized to introduce the company's founder. The strategic partnership remained undecided. After the formal presentation ended, guests dispersed into smaller conversations. Journalists surrounded Margaret. Investors congratulated Daniel. Fashion editors requested interviews with Elizabeth. Richard remained motionless near the back of the room. Kevin approached cautiously. "You okay?" Richard answered quietly. "I don't know." Jason looked equally unsettled. "Did you know?" Richard almost laughed. "No." Brian spoke softly. "She never told you?" Richard searched for an answer. "No." Then, after a long silence, he corrected himself. "I never asked." Those 4 words surprised even him. He remembered years of conversations. He had spoken. Elizabeth had listened. He had assumed. She had observed. He had judged. She had continued working. At what point had curiosity disappeared from their marriage? He could no longer remember. Across the atrium, Elizabeth finally finished speaking with the last reporter. Emily and Olivia approached her carefully. Emily looked overwhelmed. "I don't even know what to say." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything." Olivia laughed nervously. "You own..." She looked upward toward the flagship. "All of that?" Elizabeth followed her gaze. "I helped take care of it." Emily shook her head. "You've been folding sweaters beside us every day." "I still will." Olivia stared at her. "Seriously?" Elizabeth smiled. "Tomorrow morning." Emily laughed through tears. "I thought everything was going to change." Elizabeth gently touched her shoulder. "It already changed years ago." "What do you mean?" "The moment we stopped believing our work needed applause." Emily looked around the crowded atrium. "I think I understand now." Thomas Walker joined them carrying a folder. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Thomas." He smiled. "I've suspected there was more to your story." "You were kind before you knew." Thomas nodded. "I hope I would have been kind either way." Elizabeth answered quietly. "That's what matters." He hesitated before continuing. "I should probably mention something." She looked at him attentively. "The board requested every communication regarding Elm and Ivy's lease." Elizabeth remained calm. "I expected they would. They're conducting a complete review." "Good." Thomas studied her expression. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." "Should I be concerned?" Elizabeth smiled gently. "Only if the documents aren't accurate." Thomas understood immediately. "They are." "Then there's nothing to fear." Meanwhile, Richard slowly walked alone toward the upper level. For years he had admired Maison Étoile's flagship from a distance. Today he entered through its grand glass doors for the first time since learning the truth. The boutique radiated quiet elegance. Nothing felt excessive. No loud branding, no unnecessary extravagance. Every display reflected the same understated taste Elizabeth preferred at Elm and Ivy. He suddenly recognized familiar details. The arrangement of scarves, the handwritten styling cards, fresh white lilies, soft instrumental music, even the subtle fragrance. Elm and ivy had never been separate from Maison Étoile. It had always been its foundation. He had simply failed to notice. A sales associate approached politely. "Good afternoon." Richard nodded absent-mindedly. The young woman smiled. "Is there anything I can help you find?" He looked around the magnificent store, then answered honestly, "I think I'm trying to understand something." The associate assumed he meant the collections. "Our founder believes every garment should tell a story." Richard whispered almost to himself, "I know." She smiled. "Most people don't." He almost laughed at the painful irony. No, most people didn't, including him. As evening settled over Manhattan, the media coverage spread rapidly across television, financial news websites, and fashion publications. Headlines focused on one remarkable revelation. The anonymous founder of Maison Étoile had been quietly serving customers inside her own small boutique for over a decade. Almost none of the articles mentioned Harbor Crest. Almost none mentioned Richard. Elizabeth had not allowed the day to become about personal humiliation. She had refused every opportunity to criticize anyone. Instead, she had spoken only about craftsmanship, customers, listening, purpose. Yet, Richard understood something the reporters could not. The greatest exposure had not come from anything Elizabeth said. It had come from everything she chose not to say. Her silence forced him to hear his own words far more clearly than any accusation ever could. And while the public celebrated the remarkable founder they had finally met, another process continued quietly behind the scenes. Inside Maison Étoile's legal department, additional emails, financial records, telephone logs, and banking documents continued arriving for review. Elizabeth's identity was no longer hidden. But the full truth surrounding Harbor Crest's proposal had not yet been revealed. That chapter was still waiting. Fan 13. The suspension of Harbor Crest's proposal spread through Manhattan's commercial real estate community far faster than Richard Moore had anticipated. No official statement accused anyone of misconduct. No newspaper suggested corruption. Maison Étoile's announcement had been deliberately restrained. The board had simply stated that additional governance verification was necessary before any strategic partnership could proceed. To experienced executives, however, the message carried unmistakable meaning. The proposal had entered a level of review reserved for decisions requiring exceptional scrutiny. Within days, Richard noticed subtle changes. His phone rang less frequently. Several invitations to networking dinners quietly disappeared. Conversations that once lasted an hour now ended after 10 minutes. No one treated him rudely, but the confidence others once placed in him had become noticeably cautious. Reputation, he discovered, rarely collapsed in a single moment. It faded, one unanswered question at a time. At Harbor Crest headquarters, the executive committee gathered for what had originally been scheduled as a routine quarterly planning meeting. Instead, the agenda contained only one item. Maison Étoile. The company's chief executive officer, Leonard Whitman, entered carrying a thick binder. His expression remained composed. "Good morning." The room answered quietly. Leonard took his seat. "I've reviewed Maison Étoile's latest correspondence." He looked toward Richard. "They're requesting complete documentation regarding the proposal." Richard nodded. "Yes. I want full cooperation." "Of course." Leonard opened the binder. "Our legal department has already begun an internal review." Kevin Harris exchanged a quick glance with Jason Mitchell. Richard remained silent. Leonard continued. "This is standard corporate practice." Again, he emphasized the word standard. No conclusions have been reached. Richard appreciated that clarification. So we're simply gathering records. Exactly. Leonard looked around the room. Emails, meeting notes, financial assumptions, consultant communications, telephone records were available. Every department received instructions. No accusations, no raised voices, only process. Richard understood immediately. The review now extended beyond Maison Étoile. His own employer wanted answers as well. Meanwhile, at Maison Étoile headquarters, another meeting had begun. Daniel Carter entered Elizabeth's office carrying fresh reports. We received confirmation. Elizabeth looked up from a design sketch she had been reviewing. About what? Harbor Crest has opened its own internal review. She nodded once. Expected. Daniel smiled. You predicted that. When organizations respect governance, independent reviews naturally follow. Sophia Reynolds joined them moments later. We've also received additional correspondence. Elizabeth accepted the folder. Inside were several newly produced email chains, meeting invitations, scheduling adjustments, internal memoranda. Most contained nothing remarkable. Then, she noticed one particular exchange. Andrew Collins had suggested postponing documentation updates until after preliminary board discussions. Richard's reply appeared beneath it. Let's provide the board exactly what they request, nothing less. Elizabeth read the sentence twice. Daniel watched her carefully. What do you think? She looked up. It matters. In what way? It demonstrates Richard requested complete disclosure. Sophia seemed surprised. That helps him. Elizabeth closed the folder. If it's true, it belongs in the record. Daniel smiled knowingly. You never collect evidence for one side. No, I collect evidence. Nothing more, nothing less. 2 days later, Harbor Crest's legal department interviewed executives connected to the proposal. Richard entered the conference room promptly at 10. Waiting inside were Leonard Whitman, General Counsel Patricia Ellis, and an external governance advisor. Patricia began calmly. This interview is administrative. Richard nodded. I understand. We're establishing chronology. She asked about proposal development, contractor estimates, meetings with Andrew Collins, communications regarding tenant placement. Richard answered every question directly. When asked about Elm and Ivy, he hesitated briefly. Patricia noticed. Take your time. Richard inhaled slowly. I believed relocating smaller tenants would improve long-term revenue. Were you referring to Elm and Ivy? Yes. Did personal considerations influence your recommendation? Richard looked down. No. Then he corrected himself. They shouldn't have. Silence filled the room. Patricia wrote several notes. Richard continued before anyone asked another question. I convinced myself I was separating business from my marriage. He paused. I don't think I actually was. Leonard observed him quietly. No one interrupted. Richard finally understood something Elizabeth had recognized months earlier. Motives often appeared far simpler before they encountered honest self-examination. That afternoon, Brian Foster visited Elm and Ivy. He hesitated outside before entering. Elizabeth greeted him exactly as she greeted every customer. Good afternoon. Brian smiled awkwardly. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. He looked around the boutique. It feels different now. Elizabeth adjusted a display of autumn scarves. Does it? I suppose I notice more. She smiled. Sometimes attention changes before places do. Brian nodded. I wanted to apologize. Elizabeth looked at him kindly. For what? I laughed. She remembered, not vividly, simply factually. You weren't unkind. I wasn't kind either. Elizabeth remained silent. Brian continued. I assumed Richard understood your work. So did many people. I should have asked questions instead. Elizabeth handed a customer a garment bag before returning. Questions are usually more useful than assumptions. Brian smiled sadly. You've said that before. I've believed it for a long time. He hesitated again. I also wanted to tell you something. She waited. Our company is reviewing everything. I expected that. People are worried. Elizabeth nodded gently. Worry doesn't change documents. Brian laughed quietly. No, it doesn't. He left a few minutes later carrying nothing except a new understanding. For the first time, he realized why Elm and Ivy had never felt small. The store reflected its owner. Quiet, careful, authentic. That evening, Emily approached Elizabeth after closing. Can I ask something personal? You may. Are you happy? Elizabeth considered the question longer than Emily expected. I feel peaceful. Is that the same thing? Not always. Emily leaned against the counter. If everything goes your way, Elizabeth smiled softly. I've never wanted everything to go my way. Emily looked confused. I wanted everything to be fair. She opened the leather notebook resting beneath the register. Inside were years of dated observations, meeting notes, customer stories, business reflections. Emily glanced at one page. You've written every day. Almost. Why? Elizabeth answered quietly. Memory changes. Paper doesn't. Emily smiled. I think that's beautiful. Elizabeth closed the notebook. It also keeps me honest. Late Friday afternoon, Sophia Reynolds received another package from Harbor Crest's legal department. The accompanying letter thanked Maison Étoile for its patience and confirmed complete cooperation with the ongoing governance review. Inside were additional communication logs, archived calendar invitations, telephone billing summaries, updated contractor correspondence. Sophia immediately delivered everything to Elizabeth. There are hundreds of pages. Elizabeth accepted the box. We'll read every one. Daniel laughed. I never doubted it. Sophia looked toward the growing archive shelves. The record is becoming enormous. Elizabeth smiled gently. The larger the decision, she rested one hand lightly on the box, the more complete the record should be. No one disagreed. That night, Richard sat alone in his study long after Elizabeth had gone to bed. The house remained silent. For the first time in years, he opened an old photo album stored inside a cabinet. There they were. Two young dreamers standing inside the first version of Elm and Ivy. The boutique had been little more than a narrow storefront with uneven wooden floors and second-hand display racks. Elizabeth stood proudly beside the front window, holding a measuring tape around her neck. He remembered taking that photograph. Back then, he had admired her determination. He had celebrated every small success. When had admiration become embarrassment? When had encouragement become criticism? He searched his memory. No single answer appeared. Only dozens of small choices. Small dismissive comments, small assumptions, small moments when ambition quietly replaced gratitude. He closed the album. Across the hallway, Elizabeth's notebook rested on her bedside table. Inside it, years of carefully preserved observations waited patiently beside archived emails, financial records, inspection reports, and legal correspondence. Richard had spent years believing power belonged to whoever spoke with the greatest confidence. Elizabeth had quietly demonstrated something far more enduring. Real strength belonged to the person who allowed truth enough time to become undeniable. And the truth was approaching its final chapter. By early December, Manhattan had begun preparing for the holidays. Storefronts glowed beneath strands of warm white lights. Window displays filled with winter collections attracted crowds from every corner of the city. Snow fell lightly one morning, disappearing almost as quickly as it touched the sidewalks. Elm and ivy welcomed the season as it always had. Fresh evergreen branches framed the entrance. Handwritten holiday cards accompanied every purchase. Soft piano music replaced the autumn jazz playlist. For Elizabeth Moore, however, the quiet beauty of the season marked something else. It was time to close one chapter of her life with the same dignity she had tried to preserve throughout it. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since Maison Étoile had suspended Harbor Crest's proposal. The internal reviews were complete. The legal analyses had been finalized. Every requested document had been collected. Every timeline had been verified. The conclusion was measured and precise. Harbor Crest's proposal contained optimistic assumptions that required significant revision before it could be considered again. The governance review also confirmed that communications surrounding tenant optimization had created an appearance of inappropriate influence, even though no evidence established fraud or criminal misconduct. The board therefore declined to proceed with the proposal in its current form. The decision was unanimous. No public condemnation followed. No press conference criticized Harbor Crest. No executive was publicly shamed. Maison Étoile simply selected a different strategic direction. For Elizabeth, that was enough. Justice did not require spectacle. It required fairness. At Harbor Crest, Leonard Whitman met privately with Richard. The CEO closed the office door before speaking. "I wanted this conversation to remain between us." Richard nodded quietly. "I appreciate that." Leonard placed the final review report on the desk. "Our board has accepted the governance committee's recommendations." Richard already understood what that meant. "The proposal is finished." "Yes." Leonard leaned forward. "I also need to make an organizational decision." Richard remained silent. "You'll be stepping down as Director of Retail Development." The words were calm, professional, measured. "We're offering you a consulting transition through the end of the quarter." Richard absorbed the decision without argument. He had spent weeks preparing himself for this possibility. "I understand." Leonard looked at him carefully. "For what it's worth." Richard met his eyes. "I don't believe you intended to damage the company." Richard answered honestly. "I didn't. I believe you convinced yourself you were acting objectively." Richard lowered his head. "I did." Leonard sighed quietly. "Sometimes that's the most dangerous mistake." Richard nodded. "I know." There were no raised voices, no accusations, only consequences arriving through ordinary corporate procedure. 2 days later, Elizabeth met her attorney, Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca had represented Maison Étoile for years and occasionally handled Elizabeth's personal legal matters. She placed a thin folder on the conference table. "The documents are ready." Elizabeth opened it. Petition for dissolution of marriage, property settlement, confidentiality provisions, financial disclosures. Everything had been prepared carefully. Rebecca watched her client for several moments. "Are you certain?" Elizabeth closed the folder gently. "I've had a long time to think." "You've never spoken with anger." "There isn't any." "Then why now?" Elizabeth looked toward the snow-covered rooftops outside the office window. Because respect cannot survive indefinitely without honesty. Rebecca nodded slowly. I understand. We've grown into different people. You still care about him? Elizabeth answered truthfully. I care about the person he once was. Rebecca said nothing more. Some answers deserved silence. Richard received the legal documents the following afternoon. He read every page carefully. There were no excessive financial demands, no attempt to punish him, no hidden clauses. Elizabeth requested only what the law considered fair. Nothing more. He called her that evening. Would you meet me? She answered quietly. Yes. They chose a small private conference room inside Rebecca Lawson's office. No restaurant, no dramatic setting, no emotional audience. Only 2 chairs separated by a polished wooden table. Richard arrived first. Elizabeth entered a few minutes later, wearing the same understated elegance she carried everywhere. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard broke the silence. I've practiced this conversation 100 times. Elizabeth smiled faintly. I imagine none of them sounded right. No. He looked down at the documents. You could have destroyed me. Elizabeth answered gently. I never wanted to. You had every opportunity. I had every responsibility not to. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I keep remembering all the things I said. Elizabeth remained quiet. I called Elm and Ivy embarrassing. She nodded once. I know. I laughed at your work. Yes. I introduced you as though... His voice faltered. As though your life was something to apologize for. Elizabeth looked at him with unmistakable compassion. You don't have to repeat everything. I do. No. She shook her head softly. You need to understand it. Richard looked at her. I finally do. Another long silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, simply honest. Richard glanced toward the leather notebook resting beside Elizabeth. I've wondered about that notebook. She placed one hand upon it. I've carried one for years. You wrote about me? Sometimes. He hesitated. Can I see? Elizabeth considered the request. Then she slowly opened the notebook. She turned several pages before stopping. Richard expected to find pages filled with anger. Evidence collected for revenge, lists of insults. Instead, he found dated observations. March 12th. Richard seemed exhausted today. Remember to leave dinner warm. June 4th. He worries too much about work. October 18th. He apologized to the waiter after a difficult meeting. He still has kindness in him. December 22nd. He smiled the way he used to while helping a child retrieve a dropped shopping bag. Richard stared silently. You didn't write the worst things. I didn't need to. Why? Elizabeth looked at him calmly. I never wanted my memories to become unfair. He swallowed hard. What about later? She turned another page. The handwriting remained just as careful. April 8th. Richard laughed at the boutique in front of colleagues. No commentary, no accusation, only the event. May 16th. Suggested closing Elm and Ivy again. June 2nd. Another public remark. He looked up. You recorded facts. Yes. Not feelings. My feelings changed. She closed the notebook. The facts didn't. Richard suddenly understood why Elizabeth had remained so calm for so long. She'd never relied upon emotion to tell her story. She had relied upon truth. Rebecca entered briefly to answer several legal questions. Both parties reviewed the settlement. Minor revisions were agreed upon. Every signature was completed without dispute. Before leaving, Richard looked toward Elizabeth one final time. "I don't deserve your kindness." Elizabeth answered softly, "This isn't kindness." He looked puzzled. "What is it?" "It's choosing not to become someone I would regret." Those words remained with him long after she left. That evening, Elizabeth returned to Elm and Ivy. The boutique had already closed. Emily was finishing holiday inventory. She noticed the signed documents in Elizabeth's hand. "It's done," Elizabeth nodded. "Yes." Emily walked over carefully. "How do you feel?" Elizabeth looked around the quiet store. The wooden shelves, the fresh evergreen decorations, the familiar work table where she had altered hundreds of garments. She smiled gently. "Lighter." Emily hugged her without saying another word. Elizabeth quietly turned off the last display light before leaving. Outside, snow continued falling across Manhattan. Inside her bag rested finalized legal documents. Not symbols of victory, simply the closing pages of a life that no longer reflected the values she wished to carry forward. Tomorrow morning, she would unlock Elm and Ivy again. Exactly as always. Only this time, she would do so without pretending that silence alone could preserve a marriage already undone by years of quiet disrespect. Fan 15. Winter settled gently over Manhattan. The shopping gallery looked different beneath the glow of holiday lights. Children paused to admire decorated storefronts. Families wandered slowly between boutiques carrying shopping bags and warm drinks. Soft music drifted through the atrium from a pianist seated beneath the enormous Christmas tree that now stood where reporters had once crowded around Elizabeth Moore. The excitement had faded. The headlines had disappeared. New stories had replaced old ones, exactly as Elizabeth had expected. Public attention was temporary. Character was not. At precisely 8:30 on the first Monday of the new year, Elizabeth unlocked the front door of Elm and Ivy. The familiar click of the lock sounded strangely comforting. Emily Parker arrived moments later carrying fresh pastries. "I thought we deserved breakfast." Elizabeth laughed quietly. "I won't argue with that." Olivia Brooks followed with a box of white lilies. "I figured we should start the year with your favorite flowers." Elizabeth accepted them with genuine gratitude. "They're beautiful." Together, they prepared the boutique exactly as they had hundreds of times before. Displays, lighting, mirrors, fresh flowers. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. During the weeks following the board's final decision, Maison Étoile announced a different strategic expansion plan. Instead of leasing additional flagship locations through Harbor Crest, the company invested in restoring several historic retail buildings across the country. The announcement surprised financial analysts. Some questioned whether preserving older neighborhoods would generate lower short-term returns. Elizabeth never answered publicly. Inside the boardroom, however, she explained her reasoning simply. Luxury should contribute something lasting to the communities that support it. The board unanimously approved the initiative. Daniel Carter later admitted he had expected nothing less. "You always think in decades." Elizabeth smiled. Businesses should. Harbor Crest eventually appointed a new director of retail development. Richard's office was reassigned. His name quietly disappeared from the company's organizational chart. There was no dramatic farewell, no scandal, only a professional transition documented through ordinary corporate procedure. Richard accepted a consulting position with a smaller commercial advisory firm several months later. The work was different. The salary was lower. The responsibilities were narrower. For the first time in years, however, success no longer depended upon appearing important. It depended upon careful work. Strangely, he found that comforting. His new colleagues knew little about his past. They judged him only by the quality of his recommendations. Richard discovered that beginning again required far more humility than beginning for the first time. One snowy afternoon, he returned to the shopping gallery. Not for a meeting, not for business, simply to walk. He paused outside Elm and Ivy. Through the window, he saw Elizabeth helping a teenage girl choose a dress for a scholarship banquet. The young customer stood nervously before the mirror. "I don't think I belong there," she admitted. Elizabeth adjusted the dress gently. "You were invited?" "Yes." "Then you already belong." The girl's eyes filled with quiet confidence. Richard smiled sadly. That sentence sounded exactly like something Elizabeth herself had once needed to hear. He did not enter. He understood some moments belonged only to those living them. Instead, he continued walking. As he passed beneath the grand staircase, he looked upward toward Maison Étoile's flagship. For years, he had admired the store because of what it represented. Now he admired it because he finally understood how it had been built. Not by prestige, not by ego, but by thousands of ordinary conversations taking place in a boutique below. Inside Maison Étoile headquarters, Margaret Sullivan prepared for retirement. After nearly 3 decades serving corporate boards, she had decided the time had come to step away. She invited Elizabeth to lunch. "I've been thinking." Elizabeth smiled. "That usually means you've made a decision." Margaret laughed softly. "It does." She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was her formal retirement letter. "I'd like you to become chair." Elizabeth looked at the letter without touching it. "There are more experienced candidates." "There are louder candidates," Margaret corrected herself. "Experience isn't measured by age alone." Elizabeth remained thoughtful. "I've never wanted titles." "I know." "Then why me?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Because I've watched you choose fairness over convenience every single time." She paused. People trust organizations when they trust the people making difficult decisions. Elizabeth finally accepted the envelope. "I'll consider it carefully." "I expected you would." Neither woman celebrated. Both understood that leadership was never a prize. It was another responsibility. Late one afternoon, Emily found Elizabeth reorganizing customer notes accumulated over the past year. "You still keep every note?" Elizabeth nodded. "They're important." Emily laughed. "You own one of the most respected luxury brands in America. And you could hire an entire department to do this." Elizabeth smiled. "They wouldn't remember Mrs. Peterson's favorite sleeve length." Emily shook her head affectionately. "I don't think you'll ever change." Elizabeth looked around the boutique. "I hope not." She picked up another handwritten card. It contained measurements for a retired school teacher who had become one of Elm and Ivy's first customers years earlier. Some records protected companies. Others protected relationships. Elizabeth valued both equally. Several months later, Maison Étoile held its annual leadership conference. Executives from around the country gathered in New York. Daniel concluded his presentation by displaying a single photograph. Elm and Ivy. Not the flagship, not corporate headquarters, just the modest boutique where everything had begun. Several new executives looked surprised. Daniel smiled. "If you ever wonder why this company asks so many questions before making decisions," he paused, "visit this store." No further explanation was necessary. As spring approached, Elm and Ivy continued welcoming customers exactly as it always had. The elderly music teacher returned for another coat. The young attorney, now recently promoted, purchased her second tailored suit. The college student who had once saved months to buy a scarf entered carrying her first professional paycheck. Elizabeth remembered every one of them. Success had never changed what mattered most: listening, remembering, serving. One quiet evening after closing, Elizabeth stood alone near the boutique entrance. The shopping gallery had nearly emptied. She looked upward toward the illuminated Maison Étoile flagship. Years earlier, she had often stood in exactly the same place, wondering whether she could build something that would last. Now she knew the answer. Not because the company had become famous, not because it had become profitable, but because its values had survived success. She turned off the final light inside elm and ivy and stepped into the corridor. The reflection in the glass briefly showed both stores at once: the small boutique below, the celebrated flagship above. They had never been opposites. One had always existed because of the other. The narrator understood something that neither wealth nor recognition could ever fully explain. Richard lost far more than a prestigious position. He lost the privilege of sharing a life with someone whose greatest strength was never hidden wealth. It was unwavering character. Elizabeth, meanwhile, gained nothing she had not already possessed. She simply stopped allowing others to misunderstand it. In the end, the boutique remained exactly where it had always been. Not because its owner lacked ambition, but because she understood that greatness is not measured by how high someone climbs. It is measured by whether they still recognize the people standing at the ground floor after reaching the top. The story ends where it truly began, not in a boardroom beneath a spotlight or inside a courtroom, but in the quiet space where people reveal who they are through everyday choices. Elizabeth Moore never needed to prove her worth with titles, wealth, or public recognition. Her integrity was visible in the way she listened, before speaking, documented before judging, and chose fairness over revenge, even when she had every opportunity to humiliate the person who had underestimated her. Richard's greatest loss was not a business proposal or an executive title. Those could eventually be replaced. His greatest loss was realizing too late that respect cannot survive where appreciation has disappeared. By the time he understood the value of the woman beside him, she had already spent years building a life rooted in dignity rather than recognition. Perhaps that's why stories like this stay with us. They remind us that the strongest people are often the quietest, that the most powerful evidence is often the truth preserved over time, and that real justice does not need anger to make itself known. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to know your thoughts. Have you ever seen someone underestimated simply because others judged appearances instead of character? Feel free to share your perspective in the comments wherever you're watching from. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about resilience, integrity, and justice finding its own path, consider liking this video and subscribing. We'd be honored to have you join us for the next journey.